Mark, can you tell us about chronographs? Because there's a lot on this in terms of our industry.
There is. I mean,
Watch world.
We know blokes in the UK, well, blokes actually the world over, love a chronograph. So chronograph, literally, my understanding comes from the Greek chrono, time, graph, writer, time writer. And basically that's what they do. They time things. So you can time an egg, you can time a race, you can time your car parking, whatever it happens to be. And it's a really useful function, a useful complication. And probably 1816, Louis Monet developed a chronograph. The most common one that people talk about is a chap called Riasek, who developed literally a time writer in 1821. So Louis XVII could time his horse races. It was effectively using paper and ink and some mechanism to record times. And that's really where kind of chronographs started. But where they started to evolve into something like we would recognize today was 1913 with Longines. They introduced a monopusher chronograph. So monopusher, one button. One button. There you go. There you go. So it was a one-button chronograph, and that had the function of starting, stopping, and resetting the chronograph functions on this watch.
So you get complications within complications.
You do get yeah, indeed, yeah. So that was 1913, and then Breitling, who've got a great sort of history in terms of developing chronographs, in 1915. Put a button at 2 o'clock, and it might sound like it wasn't significant, but in the Longines, the start-stop reset button was in the winding crown, usually at sort of 3 o'clock. So Breitling then developed the design of chronographs further by putting the start-stop reset button at 2 o'clock and leaving the crown as a winding mechanism. So that was an advance. It might not seem like anything particularly, but it was significant. And then to further add to the significance, I think it's in 1934, Breitling were at it again, and placed the reset button and the 4 o'clock position. So then you have what we would recognize as what a chronograph looks like today. You've got 3 buttons on the right-hand side of the watch. The one in the middle is a winding crown. The one at 2 o'clock is your start-stop, and the one at sort of 4 o'clock is your reset button for your chronograph. So that's thanks to Breitling in 1934, giving us what looks like the chronograph that we all know and love today. And boy, do people love it. I mean, it is a really useful function. So that was how your chronograph arrived. The development further, while we're talking about buttons and chronographs, you occasionally get a third button that's related to your chronograph, and that normally indicates that the watch is a rattrapante, which in French means catch up. And they're also known as split seconds chronographs, and this is going to take some possibly some imagination and some explaining, but essentially a split seconds chronograph has 2 second hands, one over the top of the other. So and when you press the start button, both seconds hands set off together. And if you press the rattrapante button, the first hand carries on and the second hand stops. The seconds hand stops. So you can do lap times.
I was going to ask you, could you give us an example of when that would be? Yeah. Because you don't need that for timing your eggs.
You don't need that, no. But, unless you want 2 eggs and you want one a bit longer than the other, maybe you would get away with that. But and then if you press the rattrapante button again, the seconds hand that stopped catches up with the first hand, and off they go around the dial together, and then you can press it again and do another lap time. I mean, they are really complicated, really. I'm going to say quite expensive. I mean, a Patek model is about £215,000. There are obviously cheaper versions of that, but there's an obvious complexity in the chronograph movement to allow those the 2 second hands to work together, and then one to stop, and then to catch up as well. It's quite something. Again, there's a lot of parts in a chronograph, So about 270 parts in a manual wind chronograph, and in a rattrapante, I don't know, well over 300, 312 or so parts in a Patek split-second chronograph. So it's a lot to cram into something that's, I don't know, 40 mil case.
Yeah, and what's produced at the end is always very beautiful as well.
Yeah.
It's not just something that's crammed in, as you say. It's,
Exactly. So they were manual wind chronographs, but one of the things that's we always talk about in the folklore of watch history was the race to produce the automatic chronograph, culminated in 1969 with actually Zenith producing. Well, like many things in watches, there's always several people claiming that they did things the first. But to make an automatic winding chronograph was a thing. It was an aim. You had people like Hoyer, Breitling, Buren, and Dubois de Praz working on what became Caliber 11, the Chronomatic, which featured in the Hoyer movements, in Hoyer watches and in Breitling watches in the early 70s. But arguably Zenith got there first with the El Primero, the first El Primero, El Primero meaning the first in Esperanto, which was that world language that nobody ever bothered to learn to speak. But it was, I mean, the thing about that was it was a super fast movement. So 36,000 vibrations per hour make it super fast, super accurate, and it's a legendary movement.
Yeah.
And there's probably a whole podcast in the development and the fact that movement was actually saved when Zenith had when the quartz crisis hit the Swiss watch industry, how that Zenith movement and all the tooling was saved by one of the members of the Zenith workforce. But an incredible watch, still in the collection today. It's evolved. They're now doing like 1/10 of a second versions of the El Primero movement, and the Chronomaster original with its kind of iconic 3-coloured subdials, about 7,300 pounds, is a fantastic watch, really terrific, and a significant development in the history of chronographs.
Yeah, it carries its legacy and continues with it. A brand we're beginning to see quite a lot of activity on, and it's again what we were talking about before. It's the variety even within a complication.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even then you touched on 3 or 4 different types, and but it's a fascinating industry, isn't it? And I keep going back to the level of detail that they introduced.